All right, Barak, that's good. Okay, so Barak, say, hey everybody, welcome back to Babylon Talmud.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Babylon Talmud.
Oh, that's very good. Oh, good job. Okay, that was good. All right. So Barak, that's good. That's a nice dance. Oh, what? Very good. Wow. Oh my gosh, Barak, that's very good. No one's gonna want to listen to me. They're just gonna want to watch you. Wow. That's some very good moves. Barak, nobody can see you. You're out of the frame, Barak.
Why?
What do you mean, why? I mean, oh, very good. No, you're still kind of out of the... Yeah, that's better. Yeah, if you could see yourself, you're in the frame. If you can't, yeah, very good. All right. Oh, wow. Ooh, whoa. That was not... Wow. Very, very good.
All right, big guy. Let's let Uncle Shirley go ahead and do his thing. What do we say to Uncle Shirley for letting us be on the video?
Thanks.
You're welcome. Hey everyone, what's happening? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Aleph, Daf 71 of Masechta Ayruvin. Yeah, whatever, it's a good daf, why not? So, some of the stuff we'll talk about is understanding Beis Shammai versus Beis Hillel in terms of, do you have to mevatel your reshus before Shabbos, or can you do it on Shabbos? And then we get to like a new Mishnah which talks about pre-existing partnerships, right? So if, for example, you have some chatzers in a mavoi, and the chatzeros, they don't make an ayruv, they don't like join together specifically, but they actually already had certain, let's say, business partnerships pre-existing. So do they have to make an additional partnership in the ayruv? Do they have to come together like that, or can they rely on sort of this partnership that they already have in other areas? So that's today's daf. Let's start on daf Ayin Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Tashma, come in here. Yisrael v'ger shruyin b'megora achas. Okay, so if you have a Yisrael, a Yid, and another Yid, but this second Yid is a convert. And what's unique about a convert is that, as we've seen already a few times, that if a convert dies and he doesn't have any relatives, well then, basically his possessions just become up for grabs, and whoever makes the chazakah first gets them. So, if you have a Yid and if you have a Yisrael and a Ger, Shruim b'megora achas, and they are living in some kind of like dormitory, essentially a chutzner, right? Essentially a place where there are two houses that share in another space. Umeis ger miva'od yom. So, and then the convert dies, but he dies before Shabbos begins. Okay? So now, so even though another Yid then came along and made a chazakah on this person, on this convert's property, before Shabbos, so and now basically another person owns what did belong to the convert. So now there's the original Jew who was there, and now this other Jew who just chapped the Rhine. So now it's going to cause a headache for the original Yid because they have to make an ayruv. But if the convert died on Shabbos, which means that when Shabbos began, the convert and the other Jew had already made an ayruv together. So when Shabbos began, there was already an ayruv. Well, if that's the case, even though no other Jew took possession of this convert's property, and the Gemara is going to ask, what does it mean even though? I mean, isn't it dafka because nobody took possession? We're going to have to see. Eino oser, it doesn't cause a headache for the Yisrael, because when Shabbos began, he had an ayruv with the convert. So when the convert dies, the ayruv remains intact. Hagufa kasha. Now the Gemara says, one second, this is inherently contradictory. On the one hand, Amart mi ba'od yom, on the one hand you said that if the convert were to die before Shabbos, afal pi shehechzik, even though he made a chazakah, right, meaning that the convert died before Shabbos began, and another Yid came and took possession of the convert's property, so that now when Shabbos begins, there's essentially 2 Yid in this property, in this chotzer, let's call it. V'lo mibaya ki lo echzik. And then certainly if no other Jew would have come and made a chazaka, well then it would make a headache then it would cause a problem. Meaning, if the convert died before Shabbos began and nobody came and made a chazaka, so then it would be a headache. But what do you mean? Adrabah, ki lo echzik lo asar. If nobody came, well then there's no problem. Right? Meaning, because if nobody came, well then you have this Yisrael and this ger who are sharing a chatzar. The convert died before Shabbos began. Nobody made a chazak on the property. So that means that when Shabbos began, there was only 1 Yid living in the chatzar. So then, what's the problem? So Papa says, Papa ema afal pisha lo echzik. So let's say that, even though nobody came and made a chazaka, so then it will still be a problem for this Yisrael who's living in the chatzar. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but the question is why. But 1 second. But the Brisa says that even though somebody came and did make a chazaka, not that even though nobody made a chazaka, so the Gemara says, Hachi Ka'amar. This is what the Brisa is saying. Even though this second Yid who made a chazaka on this property of the ger, he only made the chazaka on Shabbos itself, and therefore, right, when Shabbos began, it was only the original Yid living in the chatzar. The convert had already died. Nobody had yet been machzik the property, and somebody only came to be machzik only later on Shabbos. Nonetheless, right, it was only machzik on Shabbos. Nonetheless, since this second Jew could have made a chazaka on the property of the ger before Shabbos began, well, oser mishachashecha, he also makes it oser. Oser. He still makes it oser, because since he could have theoretically taken possession of this property before Shabbos, well, then it's kind of just in this pending state until Shabbos, right? Even when Shabbos begins. So it's not really like when Shabbos began, it was mutter, and therefore it's mutter for the entire Shabbos, because the whole time was kind of in this pending state that anybody could really come and make a chazaka, and therefore, so even though the second Yid only made a chazak on it once Shabbos began, still it will cause a headache for the first Yid who lived there. So if the convert died already once Shabbos began, so even though no other Yid came and was machzik the property that belonged to the convert, nonetheless it's no problem for the Yid who was there from before. And then the Gemara says, what do you mean? Right? What do you mean? Even though nobody else came to take possession, it doesn't create a headache for the original person who lived there, right? And what? And then certainly if somebody did come, then it wouldn't create a headache. Meaning, no, it's much less of a headache if nobody shows up. So adrabah ki echzik oser, right? If somebody comes and takes possession of this property, well, that would be the case where it creates a headache for the person who was over there, who was there from before, because now he's sharing a space with somebody else. So no, so I'll say even though somebody came and made a chazaka, it doesn't cause a problem. But it says even though nobody came, it doesn't create a problem. So this is what it means. Even though this other person came and made a chazaka after Shabbos began, since he was unable to have made a chazaka before Shabbos began, because the convert was still alive, Eino Oser, it doesn't create a headache for the original person who lived there. Katani Mias Reisha, what did we say at the beginning? Oser, that if the convert died before Shabbos began. If the convert died before Shabbos began, so then if somebody else makes a chazaka, it causes a headache. But why? Why can't he just be mevatel? Can't the Yorish just be mevatel his reshus. So amai oser nivato. Let him just be mivato reshus. So my oser nami dekatani ad shivato. So when it says, so Rav Nachman comes to answer, right? Because Rav Nachman was one who said yesterday that a inheritor is able to be mivato his reshus. So Rav Nachman would answer this by saying what it means is that it's going to be oser only until he's mevatel it, but once he's mevatel it, then it's fine. Now Rabbi Yochanan gives a different take on this. Masniasa money beis shammai, that these brises are beis shammai. So meaning Rav Nachman had said that somebody who inherits a property on Shabbos is able to be mevatel his reshus to the property so that other people can carry. Now Rava had asked questions on Rav Nachman from these brises that we just saw. Rav Nachman answered them by saying that, when it says that the inheritors are unable to be mevatel, it's only that they're only, so he's saying that it's not that they're unable to be mevatel, it's just that the other people are going to be unable to carry until they're mevatel, but they can always be mevatel. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, no, these brises are saying that the inheritors would be unable to be mevatel the reshus. However, these brises are not according to Beis Hillel, they're according to Beis Shammai, who says that you would have to be mevatel your reshus before Shabbos. And here obviously it's too late, right? So masniasa money Beis Shammai. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, the author of these brises, who says that that these inheritors are unable to be mevatel the reshus on Shabbos, it is Beis Shammai, the Amri, that they say ein bitul reshus b'Shabbos, that you're not able to be mevatel your reshus on Shabbos. The Tanan is, we learn in our Mishnah, me'emasai nosnin reshus. When do you give reshus? When are you mevatel your chatzar? When are you mevatel your reshus? Beis Shammai ob mibod yom, Beis Hillel ob mishatechshach. Beis Shammai says that you're mevatel your reshus before Shabbos. Beis Hillel says that you can be mevatel your reshus even on Shabbos. Therefore, these brises that are saying that these inheritors are unable to be mevatel their reshus on Shabbos, it's Beis Shammai who says that you would have to be mevatel before Shabbos. But Beis Hillel would say it's no problem. Amar Ula metame de Beis Hillel. So now Ula says, what's pshat with Beis Hillel? Why does Beis Hillel say that you're allowed to be mevatel your reshus on Shabbos? So naise ka'omer kalach etzel yafis. Interesting. So Ula says, well, because this is a situation of kalach etzel yafos. What's kalach etzel yafos? Who could tell me? Kalach etzel yafos means that if Reuven goes into Shimon's field and he separates truma, okay, so Shimon's got his whole field, and Reuven goes over there and he separates truma for Shimon. Now, Shimon didn't ask him to separate truma; he just went and separated truma. So, is that okay or is it not okay? Well, we say if Shimon comes into his field the next morning and he looks at Reuven and he says, "Wow, did you separate truma for me? That's so nice of you. Thank you so much. But you know what? You should have gone to the really good stuff. How come you separated from this stuff? You should have gone to the really, really nice stuff and separated truma from there." So we see that clearly from the fact that Shimon is suggesting that he should have taken from even the better stuff, clearly it was okay for him, right? It was okay from his perspective. And therefore we're going to apply the same thing over here to being mevatel reshus on Shabbos. That Beis Hillel is going to view being mevatel reshus on Shabbos from the fact that, right, that this guy is saying, look, I forgot to join in your ayruv, but I'm happy to just be mevatel my reshus to you guys. So clearly that indicates that already when Shabbos began, that was sort of his intention that he was going to be mevatel his reshus. So therefore, it's not like when Shabbos began, it was aser, because really his intention the whole time was clear that it was okay with him that he would be mevatel his reshus. So Amar Abaye says, Meis nachri b'Shabbos mai kalach etzel yafos. But when you have a situation like this, where you have a non-Jew who dies on Shabbos, and then the inheritor, we're saying, can be mevatel reshus, what does that have to do with kalach etzel yafos and saying what his intention was initially? So So Abaye says this is what the machlokas is between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The Beis Shammai saver bitul reshus mikna reshusahu. So according to Abaye, Beis Shammai understand being mevatel your reshus as making a kinyan essentially. So if you have, let's say, 5 people in a chatzar, one person forgot to join in the ayruv, and he says, okay, I'll be mevatel my reshus to everybody else. He's basically being makna his reshus to them. It's a kinyan, and since it's a kinyan, Beis Shammai says you can't do it on Shabbos because it's like masa umatan on Shabbos. It's like you're doing business. It's similar to mekach umemkar. Whereas Beis Hillel saber is taluke reshusa ba'amu v'staluke reshusa b'Shabbos shaper dami. Whereas Beis Hillel say, look, when this guy's mevatel his reshus, he's not making a kinyan. He's just leaving his property. That's it. He can leave his property on Shabbos if he wants, no problem. Alright, Chevra, new Mishnah. Baal habayis sheyeshutef l'shcheinav l'zeh b'yayin v'lzeh b'yayin einon tzrichen la'ariv. Very interesting. So let's say you have a mavui, and in the mavui there are 3 chatzers. Okay. Now let's say that one of the chatzer belongs to Shimon, one belongs to Levi. One belongs to Reuven, one of them belongs to Shimon, one of them belongs to Levi. Very good, our friends. Now, Reuven is a shtickle macher, and he's got all sorts of partnerships with everybody else. So Reuven, he owns some wine with Shimon, and he also owns some wine with Levi. So basically, at the end of the day, everyone's already joined together in different kinds of partnerships. So in addition to those partnerships, do they have to make an ayruv? Or can we say, look, they're already joined together in terms of like their wine dealings, so maybe that can work automatically by default, de facto as an ayruv as well. And that's what the Mishnah seems to be saying. So if you have Reuven, who already had partnerships with Shimon and with Levi with wine, they don't need to make an additional ayruv because they've already joined together. However, if Reuven's partnership with Shimon is regarding wine, but Reuven's partnership with Levi is with oil, well then they would need to make an additional ayruv because since one partnership is oil and one partnership is wine, that's not considered like they're all joined together, and they would have to make an additional ayruv. Reb Shimon Omer echad zeh v'echad zeh einon tzrichen ayruv. Whereas Reb Shimon says, no, in both cases they wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv. Whether all the partnerships were wine or even in the case where one partnership is wine and one partnership is oil, they also wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav v'chli echad. Rav says that when the Reisha of the Mishnah says, when the Tanakama says that if the 2 partnerships, right, the partnership between Reuven and Shimon and the partnership between Reuven and Levi are both wine, so then they wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv. Says Rav that would only be if all of the wine is in one vessel, is in one kli, in one barrel. But if they were in separate kelim, i.e., if the partnership between Reuven and Shimon, their wine was in one barrel, and the partnership between Reuven and Levi, their wine was in a separate barrel, well then they would be unable to, then they would have to make an additional ayruv, but that wouldn't be considered like one joining together for everybody. Rava, so Rava says you can also actually infer this, the katani, as it says in our Mishnah, that it says in the Seifa that when they would have to make an additional ayruv, it's when Reuven's partnership with Shimon was with wine and Reuven's partnership with Levi was with oil. In that case, they have to make an ayruv. So Rava says, look, I understand that if we say that the Seifa, which is talking about wine and oil, is talking about obviously in 2 different kelim, but the ratio when it says that both of the partnerships are with wine, so that is talking about one kli. So then I get it, right? The Seifa, they have to make an additional ayruv because it's 2 separate kelim, and in the Reisha, they don't have they don't have to make an additional ayruv because their partnership works because it's all in one kli. Eliyamad Reisha b'shnei kelim v'Seifa b'shnei kelim. But says Rava that if you want to argue that the Reisha is talking about 2 separate barrels of wine and the Seifa is talking about 2 separate barrels, one of wine, one of oil, well then Mali yain v'yain, mali shemen v'shemen. Says Rava, what's the difference if it's 2 barrels of wine or if it's 1 barrel of wine and 1 barrel of shemen? The fact of the matter is it's 2 separate kelim. So Rava therefore wants to argue that the reason why the partnership works in the Reisha is because it's all in one vessel. And therefore that supports Rav, who says that it has to be in one vessel. Abaye says to Rava that that's not necessarily a good proof, because yain v'yain, roi la'ariv, yain v'shemen, and roi la'ariv, that wine can mix with each other, oil can. And therefore I can easily argue that both the Reisha and the Seifa are talking about 2 separate kelim, right? The Seifa is talking about 1 barrel of wine and 1 barrel of oil, and the Reisha could theoretically be talking about 2 separate barrels of wine. And yet, I could still theoretically make the argument that they would not have to make an additional ayruv, since wine could mix with other wine, and that would be okay. Whereas wine and oil can't mix together, so therefore they would certainly have to make an additional ayruv. So I don't know that necessarily Abaye argues with Rav. I think he certainly argues with Rava to say that you can't necessarily bring a proof from our Mishnah. Reb Shimon Omer echad zeh v'echad zeh ein tzrichen la'ariv. So Reb Shimon says that either way, you don't have to make a new ayruv, right? Whether the two partnerships were both wine, or whether one was wine and one was oil, they wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv. Fine. So now, so the Gemara asks, 1 second, wait, is Reb Shimon really saying that even if one of the partnerships was wine and one of the partnerships was oil, they wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv? And you have this one mavoi, you have 3 chatzers in the mavoi, and Reuven has a partnership with Shimon with wine, and Reuven has a partnership with Levi with oil, and we're saying that that's enough to be considered an ayruv for Shabbos, and they can all carry in the different chatzeris? So Amar Rabba, interesting. So Rabbah answers and says, no, certainly not. If that were the case, then yes, certainly that would not work as an ayruv. If that were in fact true, that we're talking about one mavui with 3 chatzers attached to it, and Reuven as a partnership with Shimon on wine and a partnership with Levi on oil, well, yeah, they would certainly have to make an additional ayruv. However, what we're talking about here is a situation where you have 3 chatzers and 2 mavuis in between them. Yeah, very exciting situation that we've encountered before, right? So you have a middle chatzer, and then on either side of the middle chatzer there is a mavui, and then on the other side of each of the mavuis is another chatzer. So you have 3 chatzers, and in between the 3 chatzers they're separated by 2 mavuis. Fine. Reuven lives in the middle chatzer. Great. Now, to the right of him, there's a mavui and then another chatzer, and in that chatzer lives Shimon, and he's got a partnership with Shimon with wine. And then to the left of Reuven, there's a mavui, and then on the other side of that mavui, there's another chatzer, and there lives Levi, and Reuven has a partnership with Levi with oil. So what it's saying is that Reuven doesn't need to make any addition, right? That we don't need to make any additional ayrovs here, because Reuven and Shimon have this wine partnership going on, so therefore that mavui is taken care of. And Reuven and Levi have their oil partnership going on, so their mavui is taken care of, and you don't need any additional ayrovs. That is what it's talking about. Reb Shimon the Taime, and Reb Shimon is consistent with his reasoning, because we've seen Reb Shimon's opinion before. Ditnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Reb Shimon Lama Davar Domer. What is this situation similar to? What situation are we talking about? We're talking about when you had 3 people who were stuck in the middle of nowhere for Shabbos, so they only have Dalet Amos. And we said that if Reuven and Levi's Dalet Amos completely overlap with Shimon's, well then Shimon can carry into Levi's, Levi can carry into Shimon, Shimon can carry into Reuven, and Reuven can carry into Shimon's, but Reuven can't carry into Levi's. So it's the same exact situation over here, right? The Shalosh Chatzeres, right? So we said, what was that situation similar to? So it was similar to the Shalosh Chatzeres, when you have 3 chatzers, Hapsuch zo lazo, that they're all open to one another, Upsuchos the reshus harabim, they're also all open to reshus harabim. Ervu shtayim achitzones ima emtzais. So if the outer chatzers made an ayruv with the inner chatzer, with the middle chatzer, he muteris imayin, so the middle chatzer can carry in between the outer ones. V'hen mutarus imayin, the outer ones can carry into the middle one. V'shayim achitzonos asur zoim zo, and the 2 outer chatzers are going to be asur with each other. And the same thing would apply here as well. That you have these 3 chatzers that are separated by 2 mavuis, and Reuven has partnerships with each of the chatzers individually. Even if one is wine and one is oil, that would be acceptable. Amalei Abaye says, Midami, can you say that they are similar? Hasam katani, shtayim achitzonos asur zoim zo. In the case that you just explained, the 2 outer chatzers, i.e. Reuven and Levi, would be unable to carry into each other's chatzers. They might be able to carry into Reuven's, but not into each other's. So v'hacha katani, but in our Mishnah it says, ein tzrichen ayruv klal, that they don't have to make an ayruv at all. So Rabbah is going to answer, my ein tzrichen ayruv, shchenim bahade balabayis. So Rabbah explains that no, what it means that they don't need to make an ayruv, it means that they don't need to make an ayruv with the balabais, i.e. Shimon and Levi don't need to make a separate ayruv with Reuven because they already have partnerships with him. But Shimon and Levi would have to make an ayruv with each other if they want to carry from one chatzor to the other, because they don't have a partnership with each other, they only have a partnership with Reuven. Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef explains Reb Shimon differently, or in the machlokas between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon differently, that the Chachamim say that if Reuven has a partnership with Shimon with wine and a partnership with Levi with oil, then they would have to make a separate chatzor, and Rav Yosef a separate ayruv. And Rav Yosef says that this is talking about our original situation when you have one mavui and 3 chatzors branching off of the mavui. So the Chachamim say that if Reb Shimon, if Reuven has a partnership with Shimon on wine, and he has a partnership with Levi on oil, well, they'd have to make a separate ayruv. Now, Reb Shimon argues and says even in that case, they would not have to make a separate ayruv. How come? So Reb Yosef Amar Reb Shimon Rabban Reb Plukta Reb Yochanan ben Nuri Rabban Kamiflige. So Reb Yosef says that Reb Shimon and the Chachamim over here are arguing in the same machlokas between Reb Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. This is a machlokas that we've seen twice in Masechta Shabbos, and now we're seeing it again here. It's a very great machlokas. The Tanan is we learn in the Mishnah Shemin Shatzaf Al Gabe Yayin. If you have oil that's floating on top of wine, and it's all truma. V'naga tvul yom b'shemen, and a tvul yom, somebody who was tamei, and then he went to the mikvah, and he's not yet. He's waiting for sunset for the nightfall so that he can eat his truma. But he's a sheni l'tuma during that day. So now he touches his truma. The truma becomes tamei. So lo pasal el shemen bilvad. So here's the thing: you had wine, and floating on top of the wine was oil. This tvul yom touched the oil. The question is, okay, the oil is certainly going to be tamei, but is the wine also tamei? Do we view them as two separate things, or are they all connected? So according to the Tanakama, so only the oil is going to be tamei because it's separate from the wine. It's distinct from the wine. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer says Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Shnein Chiburin Zelazeh, that they are both connected to each other, and therefore if you touch the oil, then your memela also going to be mitame the wine. So Rabbanan K'Rabbanan Reb Shimon K'Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So Rabbi Yosef explains that the Rabbanan here who say that when Reuven has a partnership with Shimon with the wine and with Levi with the oil, so they would still have to make another ayruv because those are two separate things. Just like the Chachamim who say that when the Tvul Yom touches the oil, the wine remains tahor. And Reb Shimon over here would hold like Reb Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that when you touch the oil, also the wine becomes tamei. So here also, right, oil and wine are considered the same, equal, and if so Reuven's two partnerships, one with oil and one with wine, would be significant enough to enable everybody to carry in the mavoi. It would work for the ayruv. They wouldn't have to make an additional one. Tani, we're learning a brisa. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai Omer says Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai, echad zeh ve'echad zeh tzrichin la'ariv. Va'afilu lazeh b'yayin v'lazeh b'yayin. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai's opinion is that even in the case where Reuven had partnerships with Shimon and with Levi, and they were both wine partnerships, still they would have to make an additional ayruv. Amar Rabba, so now explains Rabba, Zeba bilagino v'shafach, v'zeba bilagino v'shafach, kuli amalo plige dehave ayruv. That even Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai would agree that if it's talking about where they, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, they all came with their wine and they all took their wine and they poured it together into one kli, well then certainly that would be a good ayruv because it's clear which wine belonged to each person, right? Each person contributed, right? They took jugs of wine and they contributed that and they joined it all together, so it's clear that they're all coming together. We know whose wine belonged to who when they poured it together. But ki plige, where they argue, says Rabbah, is kigon shelakhu chavis shel yain b'shutfis. It's talking about where they where they purchased a barrel of wine as a partnership, right? And they purchased it together. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai savar ein breira. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says, look, we don't say breira, right? We can't know retroactively which wine belonged to who. And therefore, since we can't know whose wine belonged to who, so they would have to make a separate ayruv, and we can't consider it to be a true partnership, a true joining together. Rabbanan Save, whereas the rabbis hold, yesh breira, there is breira, and therefore we can assume that, whenever they come to drink the wine, whatever wine you drank was your wine, and it was all together in this barrel, and it's a good partnership, and you don't need to make an additional ayruv. Rav Yosef Amar, said Rav Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai v'Rabbanan besomchen al shituf makom erev kamiflegi. Rabbi Yosef says that the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is about, can you rely on the shitufei mevos that you made as an eruv as well? right? The Chacham say, look, if you came together, right? So Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai, agrees that this wine is going to work for the shitufei mivos, right? So we're talking about a mavui here. There are 3 chatzeros in the mavui. They all came together, right? They all have these partnerships regarding wine. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says it'll work for the shitufei mivos. The question is, will it also work for the ayruv chatzeros, or do they have to make a separate ayruv chatzeros? According to the Chacham, they say fine, it's fine. The wine that right their partnership with the wine works for the shitufei mivos. It also works for the ayruv chatzeros. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says that while the wine is going to work for the shitufei mivos, it doesn't trickle down to the ayruv chatzeros. Right? So again, Rav Yosef Amar says, Rav Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai v'Rabbanan b'somchen al shituf b'makom ayruv kamiflige. They're arguing about, can you rely on the shitufei mivos as the ayruv chatzeros as well? The Marsaver ein somchen, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says, no, you can't rely upon it. And therefore, yes, while the wine would work for shitufei mivos, it would not work for ayruv chatzeros. U'Marsaver somchen, whereas the Chachamim say that yes, you can apply one to the other, and therefore, if the Chacham say if their wine partnerships work for the shitufei mivos, it could also work for the ayruv chatzeros. Amr Rav Yosef Mina Aminallah, and Rav Yosef says, how do I know that this is what the argument is about? The Amr Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Halacha Reb Meir, because Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that halacha is like Reb Meir. That Reb Meir says Ein somchen al shituf b'makom ayruv, that you don't rely upon the shitufei mivos to work for the ayruv chatzeros as well. Ve Amar Rav Brona Amar Rav, and Rav Brona says in the name of Rav halacha Reb Eliezer ben Tadai, that halacha is like Reb Eliezer ben Tadai. So meaning you have Rav Yehuda saying in the name of Rav, and you have Rav Brona saying in the name of Rav. So one thing in the name of Rav is that the halacha is like Reb Meir. Now we're going to see later that Reb Meir's opinion is that ein somchen al shituf b'makom ayruv, that if you make a shitufei mivos, that won't count for the ayruv chatzeros. And we're also saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai, and therefore my taima lav mishum dechad taimahu. So why is Rav saying 2 separate things, right? We have Rabbi Yehuda saying in the name of Rav that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir, and we have Rav Brona saying in the name of Rav that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai. So says Rav Yosef, Mistama, the 2 opinions of Rav don't contradict each other. Mistama, they're the same thing, and therefore, just like Rabbi Meir is saying that we don't rely on a shitufei mivos to count for the ayruv chatzeros, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai is saying the same thing, that we don't rely on the shitufei mivos to count for the ayruv chatzeros. So there you have it, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai's opinion is that ein somchen al shituf b'makom ayruv, and therefore it must be that the machlokas between the Chachamim from our Mishnah and Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai is about whether or not you apply this rule. Chacham say no, we don't apply the rule, and therefore the shitufei mivos that you made with the wine works for the ayruv chatzeros as well. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai is saying that while the wine works for the shitufei mivos, it will not work for the ayruv chatzeros. Amalei Abai, but Abai says to Rav Yosef, V'i chad taima hu taiti och salamali. But if Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai and Rav Meir are saying the same thing, well then why does Rav have to say it twice in the name of 2 different rabbis? Like what's the point? Why not just say one or the other? Why does he have to say the same thing twice? Right? Like that the halacha is like Rav Meir and the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai. Choose one of them. They're saying the same thing anyways. There must be something more significant here. So what's interesting is that this is teaching us that by default we wouldn't go like 2 chumras by Ayruvin. We know at this point that when it comes to Ayruvin, we always go like the Mekel opinion. We always go like the lenient opinion. And therefore, if we have one opinion that's having 2 chumras, certainly we're not going to follow like both. Now, what's the opinion that's having 2 chumras over here? Rav Meir's opinion. Rav Meir has 2 chumras. One chumrah is that we don't rely on the shitufei mivos to work for the ayruv chatzeros as well. But he has another chumrah as well. And that chumrah is that not only is this true by wine, that if you make a shitufei mivos by wine, it would not work for an ayruv chatzeros, but it even applies to bread. Says Rav Meir that if you make a shitufei mivos with bread, it would not work for an ayruv chatzeros either. Now, the thing is, if Rav would only say that the halacha is like Reb Meir, so we would assume that, well, we don't hold like 2 chumras when it comes to Ayruvin. Clearly, Rav must not be holding like both of Reb Meir's chumras. So mistama, we would assume that what Rav is saying is that the halacha is like Reb Meir, that ein somchen al shituf b'makom ayruv, that we don't rely on the shitufei mivos to work for the ayruv as well. However, I would think that that's only when it comes to wine. But when it comes to bread, the shitufim mavos with bread would work for Ayruvei Chatzeros as well. So therefore, Rav had to additionally say that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadoi. How come? Because what he's saying is the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadoi, as we see in our Mishnah, that when you make a shitufim mavos with wine, it does not. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadoi's opinion is that it only works for the shitufim mavos. It does not work for the Ayruvei Chatzeros. So that is why Rav is saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadoi to say that ein tzomchin al shituf makom ayruv when it comes to wine, and then he's saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir to say that it doesn't stop with wine. It also includes bread. That if you make a shitufim mavos with bread, it would not work for your Ayruvei Chatzeros. My Rab Meir, my Rabbanan. What's this machlokes between Rab Meir and the Rabbanan about somchin al shituf makom erev? The Tanya is we learn in a brayso ma'arvin b'chatzeros bepas. So you can make an Ayruvei Chatzeros with bread, and as Rashi points out, because Ayruvei Chatzeros is about where you're spending Shabbos, and it's assumed that you're spending Shabbos wherever your food is, wherever your bread is, right? That your heart is where the bread is. Your heart isn't necessarily the place where you're living isn't necessarily defined by where your wine is. I guess maybe it depends on the person, but where you're living isn't defined by the wine. It's defined by where your bread is. So therefore, an ayruv has to be with bread. And they're unable to make an ayruv with wine because where you living is not where you want defined by wine, it's defined by bread. Mishtatvin b'mavur b'yayin, but when it comes to shitufei mivos, you don't have to use bread. You can use wine for that because that's not about where you're living, it's about just joining things together, and that can work even with wine. B'mratu l'shtativ b'pas, mishtatvin. If you want to join together with bread, that would be fine as well. Ma'arvin b'chatzeros u'mishtatvin b'mavur. So now, even though, so meaning when you make a shitufei mivos, you still also have to make an Ayruvei Chatzeros nonetheless. Right? Shelo lishkach Torah's ayruv min hatinokos, so that the children, the next generation, do not forget about the halachos of ayruv. Because if you're only going to make a shitufei mavos, you don't make an Ayruvei Chatzeros, people are going to forget about Ayruvei Chatzeros. Okay? Sheyom Rav Aseinu lo ayruv divrei Meir, because they're going to say that our fathers didn't make Ayruvs. That's Rav Meir's opinion. Therefore, he says that even when you make a shitufei mavos, you still have to make an Ayruvei Chatzeros. V'chacham o ma'arvin o mishtatven. Whereas the chacham say either you make an Ayruvei Chatzeros, meaning if you make a shitufei mavos, then you don't have to make an Ayruvei Chatzeros. That was daf ayin aleph of Masechta Ayruvin. So the first real machlokas that we got over, the first sugya that we got to over here was understanding Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel versus being mevatel your reshus. Beis Shammai says you have to do it dafka before Shabbos. Beis Hillel says you can even be mevatel your reshus on Shabbos. So Ula explains that Beis Hillel's reason is because they say that it's like kalach etzel yafos. It's like when Shimon says, to Reuven that, oh, thanks so much for taking truma. You could have even taken from the better stuff. It shows that really that was his, his intention from the beginning. That really it was happy with Reuven to do it for him. So here also, when somebody's mevatel his reshus, it's basically showing that he was happy to do it the whole time, and therefore it works. So Abaye says that the machlokes between them is about, is it a kinyan or is it just leaving your property? So according to Beis Shammai, it's actually a kinyan, and you can't make a kinyan on Shabbos because it's like mekach memkar. Whereas Abaye says, no, it's not mekach memkar, it's not a kinyan, you're just leaving your property. Then we talked about relying on pre-existing partnerships to count as your ayruv, which is very interesting, right? So the Tanakama had said that only if the partner, so if Reuven had partnerships with Shimon and also partnerships with Levi, and they were all centered around wine, so then that can count as the ayruv as well. But if one partnership was about wine, one partnership was about oil, then it would not work. Reb Shimon says even if one was wine and one was oil, that would still work as an ayruv. They would not have to make an additional ayruv. Rav says that when it comes to the two partnerships being about wine, they would all have to be in the same kli. Then we come to trying to understand Reb Shimon's opinion, right? What's the deal with Reb Shimon who says that even if one partnership is wine and one partnership is oil, they wouldn't have to make an additional ayruv? So Rabbah says, well, if it was all just the same mavoi, then yeah, they would have to make a separate ayruv. However, says Rabbah, it's talking about where you have three chatzeros separated by two mavois, and therefore when Reuven has a partnership with Shimon on the wine, well, that permits that mavoi, and when he has a partnership with Levi on the oil, it permits the other mavoi. Rabbi Yosef says that the machlokes between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon is the same machlokes as between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim when it comes to a tvu yom who touches oil. Just like the Chachamim say that a tvu yom who touches oil, the wine remains intact because they're separate. They also say that the partnership that Reuven has with Shimon on the wine is separate than the partnership that he has with Levi on the oil, and they have to make a separate ayruv. Whereas Reb Shimon holds like Reb Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that if the tvuyum touches the oil, well then the wine also becomes tamid because it's all one thing. So then here also they'll say that the partnerships between with the wine and the oil are all one thing, and it can be considered a good ayruv. Then we get to Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai's opinion on this, which is that actually, even when both partnerships are wine, it does not work. And the question is, why does it not work? So, according to Rabbah, it's because Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says we can't say breira, and therefore we can't know whose wine belongs to who. And therefore, it's not going to be a good partnership. We don't know like what each person contributed. Whereas Rav Yosef says actually the machlokas is about can you apply the shitufim vos to count for ayruv v'chatzeres as well. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says that you cannot, and therefore even though the wine that will work for the shitufim vos, it will not work for the ayruv v'chatzeres. Whereas the chacham say no, since the wine worked for the shitufim vos, it can also work for the ayruv v'chatzeres. That was daf 71. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.